The inheritance hearing ended with a sentence that sounded almost ordinary, but it changed everything. That's the entirety of the estate. No emotion, no hesitation, just a cold voice, as if everything had been arranged long before this moment. I sat across from them, my hand resting on his old bag, and caught my mother smiling faintly. Not a big smile, just that small, perfect one she always wore when things unfolded exactly as she had planned. My father had already relaxed, his hands folded neatly on the table, like he had just closed an important deal. The room felt cold. The harsh white lights were almost blinding, and the faint smell of old paperwork mixed with watered-down coffee lingered in the air. And me, I sat there, listening as each asset was read aloud, yet feeling like I was the one being erased from that list. No one looked at me. No one asked me anything. As if my existence had never really mattered. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a hearing. It was the moment my family officially erased me, legally. If you want to know what happens next, comment 1 to hear the full story. After that cold closing line, the lawyer began reading the details of each asset, slowly, clearly, and almost without emotion. The main house on Willow Creek Road, the southern plot of land, the pickup truck, all the workshop equipment, the savings accounts, even the timber rights, everything was listed one by one like an inventory. And the striking part was, every line ended the same way. Belonging to my parents. No division. No exceptions. Not a single line with my name on it. I sat there, listening to every word, every sentence, feeling like I was witnessing a perfectly legalized transfer. The lawyer's voice was steady, smooth to the point that it all sounded routine, as if this wasn't a family being torn apart, but just another simple administrative process. I glanced at my father. He wasn't surprised at all. No frown, no quiet exchange with the lawyer. He just sat there, as if he had known the outcome all along. My mother, on the other hand, gave the occasional small nod, her eyes moving across the pages like she was confirming a plan that had already been completed. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a random outcome, this was a prepared one. Each asset being read wasn't just material value, it was proof that I had been removed from this picture long before the hearing even began. But the coldest part wasn't losing everything. It was the fact that none of them thought there was anything wrong with it. Then came the final line, the one they almost rushed through. The cabin out west is to be transferred solely to the granddaughter Emery. No one looked up, no one reacted. My mother let out a soft laugh, a small, dismissive sound like she had just heard a dull joke. That cabin, I knew it well. A rotting wooden place deep in the woods, far from the main road. No electricity, no running water, warped windows, rusted hinges. It was where my grandfather used to go hunting, and later, where he went to be alone, as he liked to say. My father used to call it useless, my mother called it a memory, and the lawyer called it of negligible value. I sat there, taking the old key that was slid across the table to me, and realized that was all they had left for me. If you're still here, drop a dot. The hearing had barely ended when my mother was the first to stand. She adjusted her sleeve and looked at me with that familiar expression, calm, controlled, and not a trace of guilt. Well, that's done, she said lightly, as if she had just finished something minor. I hope you can move on. Move on. The words echoed in my head like a polite insult wrapped in courtesy. My father didn't say much. He simply picked up the car key the lawyer had placed on the table and slipped it into his pocket, like a habit already rehearsed. No glance at me, no hesitation. Don't make something out of nothing, he said flatly. Everything is legal. Legal. A single word, enough to erase every emotion, every memory, every truth that hadn't been written into a document. I looked at them, two people who had just received nearly everything my grandfather left behind, yet neither of them showed the slightest surprise. No questions, no arguments, no reaction that resembled someone who had just experienced a loss. Only certainty. That's when I realized the scariest part wasn't that they had taken everything. It was that they had prepared for this long before it happened. And now, they were simply playing their roles in an outcome that had already been written. The lawyer handed me one final envelope. Inside were the papers for the cabin and the rusted key. My mother glanced at it and smiled again. He always knew you liked old things. I tightened my grip around the key. This time, I didn't say a word. I stood up, carrying my grandfather's old bag, the envelope of documents, and the rusted key, everything that was left after the hearing. No arguments, no questions, not a single objection. Because I understood one thing very clearly. They had prepared for every possible reaction from me, except silence. If I got angry, they would call me emotional. If I questioned them, they would say I was imagining things. If I cried, they would take it as proof that I wasn't strong enough. But silence was the one thing they couldn't control. I walked out of the room, the door closing behind me without anyone calling me back. No attempt to stop me. Not a single hesitant glance. As if my leaving was something they had accepted long ago. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. But for the first time in hours, I could breathe. I didn't feel angry, no longer confused. Just one clear feeling: everything was over. Or at least, that's what they believed. I looked down at the key in my hand. A small, worn object, almost meaningless in their eyes. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Something wasn't right. I drove to the cabin that same afternoon. Not because I wanted to stay there, but because I had nowhere else to go with the truth I had just walked away with. The road into the woods was familiar. Yet this time, it felt longer than usual. The old wooden gate hung crooked, my tires sinking slightly into dry mud. Everything felt abandoned. The rusted key jammed twice before the lock finally gave in. The door let out a heavy groan as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old wood, dust, and a lingering cold, like no one had touched the place in years. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, a narrow bed, a cracked sink with no running water. My grandfather's desk was still under the window, covered in a thin layer of dust. On the shelf were a few boxes of nails, an oil lamp, and an old matchbox. Worse than I remembered, but also more real than everything that had just happened. This place didn't pretend to care about me, didn't say the word family, didn't smile and then turn away. That first night I slept in my coat, curled up under 2 old army blankets. The cold woke me up more than once, but strangely, I didn't feel empty. I was in a place no one wanted, and for the first time, I didn't have to pretend I belonged anywhere. The days that followed moved slowly, almost completely cut off from the outside world. No steady phone signal, no noise, no one asking what I was doing or where I was going. Just small tasks and time. On the second day, I cleaned out the kitchen cabinets, swept away dust and mouse droppings, and found a few old mugs wrapped in newspaper. On the third day, I drove into town to buy an oil lamp, canned food, and a battery-powered radio. On the fourth day, I discovered my grandfather's old thermos under the bed, still intact, as if he had never really left. Everything here was old. But nothing felt fake. No one here smiled at me and then turned away. No one pretended to care while calculating something behind my back. There was only silence, but it was the kind that felt peaceful. And then, on the fifth day, when the wind blew hard from the west, I noticed something strange. A section of the wall gave off a hollow sound, different from the rest. I couldn't explain why, but the feeling made me stop longer than I should have. There was something that didn't belong to the surface of this cabin. If you relate to Emery, comment 2. The longer I stayed in the cabin, the more I felt like something didn't quite add up. Not fear, exactly, but a subtle sense of misalignment, like a small detail in this room was trying to tell me something I hadn't figured out yet. The west wall caught my attention the most. Every time the wind pushed through, the sound it made was different from the rest, slightly hollow, slightly echoing. I told myself it was probably just old wood, loosened over time. But then I realized it wasn't just the wall, the painting above the bed. It wasn't just crooked, it was off in a strange way. One side hung noticeably lower, like it had been taken down and re-hung in a hurry. I stood there, staring at it longer than I should have. Not because it was beautiful, but because that sense of something being off wouldn't leave my mind. My grandfather wasn't careless. If he hung something, it would always be exactly where it belonged. I stepped closer and reached up to adjust the frame. But instead of straightening it, I stopped. A thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't hung wrong at all? What if someone meant for it to be that way? The room was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. And for the first time since arriving, I started to believe this cabin was far from what it seemed. I didn't straighten the painting. Instead, I took a deep breath, and lifted it off the hook. The moment the frame came away from the wall, a small, hollow space was revealed behind it. Not large, but enough to hide something. My heart started beating faster, not from fear, but from instinct. Inside was a thick, cream-colored envelope, placed neatly as if it had been waiting there for a long time. My name, Emery, was written on it in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. I stood still for a few seconds, holding the envelope without opening it. Not because I was hesitating, but because I understood. Once I did, everything would change. A small line beneath it sent a chill down my spine. Open this after they think they've won. After they think they've won. I let out a quiet laugh, soft but no longer weak. For the first time since the hearing, I felt like something existed outside of their plan. I sat down on the edge of the bed, placing the oil lamp beside me, staring at the envelope in my hands one more time. They think they've won. But if he left this for me, then maybe the story isn't over yet. I didn't open the envelope right away. It was the first decision I had truly thought through since arriving here. I set it down beside the oil lamp and sat quietly for a few minutes, letting my heart beat slow. Then I opened it. Inside was a long letter, a few neatly folded pages, and a small key taped to a card. My grandfather's handwriting was the same as always, clear, steady, not a single tremor. The first line made me read it twice. This cabin was never a gift. I tightened my grip on the paper. He knew exactly what would happen in that courtroom. He knew they would take everything, the things that were visible, impressive, the house, the land, the cars, all the loud assets. Let them take what they think matters. I kept reading word by word, because what truly matters isn't there. Not the cabin, not what was read aloud in that room, but something hidden, deliberately, carefully, and meant only for me. I lifted my head and looked around the small room again. Everything was the same. Old, quiet. But the feeling had completely changed. This cabin was no longer what was left behind. It was the beginning. I kept reading the letter, this time more slowly. Each line wasn't just advice. It felt like a set of instructions carefully planned in advance. Don't call them. Don't tell anyone until you have everything in your hands. I paused for a second. He hadn't just left behind a secret. He knew exactly who couldn't be trusted. I followed every step. I walked over to the cast-iron stove in the corner, crouched down, and lifted a metal panel I had never paid attention to before. It was slightly heavy, but when I raised it, a black metal box appeared underneath. My heart started pounding. Inside was a neatly organized stack of documents. Not keepsakes, not old photos, documents. I pulled out the first page, a legal certificate, stamped and signed. Certificate of trust. I scanned down the page, then froze. My name, Emery Collins, not listed in the inheritance that had been read in court, but as the beneficiary. A strange feeling spread through me, not excitement, but realization. This story was never meant to end in that courtroom. I flipped through the remaining pages, and that was the moment everything completely shifted. This cabin wasn't sitting on a small, worthless piece of land like they thought. According to the maps and documents in my hands, the total area was 69 acres. Not 5, not some forgotten corner of the woods, but an entire stretch of land running behind the mountainside, holding things the courtroom had never even mentioned. I read more closely, and my heart nearly stopped for a second. The rights to the primary water source, supplying the main house and all the land below. The only access road, the route every vehicle was required to pass through. Approval authority, any construction, sale, or extraction required consent from the trust's beneficiary, which meant me. I sat down on the floor, the papers still in my hands. My parents had the house, the land, everything they had just claimed. But they didn't have the right to use any of it without me. And the part that sent a chill down my spine the most. At the bottom of the document was a confirmation. They knew about this. Marcus and Daphne Collins. They weren't surprised. They just thought I would never find out. If you think Daphne Collins in this story is manipulative and calculating, drop a dot, so I know you're still here. I kept turning through the remaining documents, and with each page the picture became clearer and colder. A notarized memorandum signed more than a year before my grandfather passed. The language was dry, precise, but enough to settle everything. Every asset my parents had just received was bound by this trust. Not possibly. Definitely. Every transaction, loans, land sales, timber rights, even renovations, required approval from the trust's beneficiary. Which meant me. I paused at one line. Marcus Collins and Daphne Collins have been informed of these rights and hold no authority over the trust. Have been informed, not suspected. Not discovered too late, but known long before. I set the paper down on the table and stared into the empty space ahead. So everything they showed in that courtroom, the calm, the certainty, my mother's faint smile, wasn't because they had won. It was because they believed the most important part had been hidden forever. They didn't need to fight over the cabin, because in their eyes it had no value. And that belief was the biggest mistake they had ever made. The next morning, I drove into town with all the documents in my bag. First County Bank wasn't crowded, but the atmosphere inside felt different, professional, discreet, and somehow prepared for me. When I gave my name and the box number, the woman at the counter looked at her screen a few seconds longer than usual. Then her demeanor shifted instantly. Not friendlier, more serious. "You were instructed to come in after the hearing, correct?" I nodded. A few minutes later, I was led into a private room. Box 214 was placed in front of me, smaller than I expected, but heavy in a different way. Not because of its size, but because of what it held. Inside, there were no keepsakes, no old photos, just documents. A thick trust file, 2 sealed envelopes, and a summary of the current assets. I opened the first page. The familiar trust name, the land area, the usage rights, everything matched what I had found in the cabin. Then I looked at the final line, the value. I read it once, then again, $1,682,600. I sat there in silence for a few seconds. That amount was more than everything my parents had just claimed in court, and the most striking part was, this was only the beginning. Everything started to fall apart, faster than I expected. That very morning, before I even left the bank, the first signs appeared. My father contacted a lender to use the house and the southern land as collateral. But the moment the file was reviewed, it was immediately frozen. The reason? Water rights, access road, and the binding terms of the trust. All of it belonged to me, and it didn't stop there. A timber buyer requested updated legal documentation, also denied. Their lawyers began calling, demanding clarification on the rights involved. And for the first time, my parents were forced to face a truth they had deliberately ignored. The assets they held couldn't function. They couldn't borrow. They couldn't sell. They couldn't develop. Everything they thought was a victory was just the surface. By early afternoon, my phone started ringing. My mother called first, then my father, then their lawyer. I looked at the screen, but didn't answer. Until the 5th call. I picked up, no greeting, no emotion. Just one question from my father: "What did he leave you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the documents spread out in front of me. The trust, the maps, the legal rights, all the things I hadn't even known existed just a few hours earlier. Then I picked up the phone, my voice calmer than I expected. "Something bigger than you think." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. The certainty from the courtroom was gone. The control in his voice, gone. What remained was a real question. "What do you want?" Not "Are you okay?" Not "We need to talk." But a negotiation. I looked up at the lawyer sitting across from me. She didn't say a word, just gave a slight nod. And I understood. This was no longer about emotion. This was about power. "I want the inheritance records amended," I said clearly. "I want everything related to the trust disclosed. And from now on, all communication goes through my attorney." There was no immediate response, but I knew, this time, they were the ones listening. 3 weeks later, the records were adjusted. What they received remained the same, but now came with an undeniable truth. Everything depended on the trust. I didn't sell the land right away. No rush. I kept the cabin, kept the road, kept the water rights, and most importantly, I kept the decision-making power. That was what my grandfather had truly left me. Not just assets, but control.